Welcome everyone to this morning's plenary talk. I have the honor of introducing Adele Goldberg. The first most important thing, Adele tells this great story that she once was invited to give a talk at an institution, and she was introduced as the computer scientist Adele Goldberg from the University of Chicago. And then she went to give the talk and she realized that the people had actually invited the wrong Adele Goldberg, and she wanted and they wanted the computer scientist and not her. This is not the computer scientist Adele Goldberg, and I'm very sure that this is also the Adele Goldberg we wanted to invite. I'm very, very happy about this. So Adele Goldberg is Professor of Linguistics and Professor of Psychology at Princeton University. She got her PhD in 1992 at the University of California, Berkeley, and she is one of the most influential and important figures in cognitive linguistics and in construction grammar. Particularly their two books, her 1995 Constructions and her 2006 Constructions at Work, that have had a very lasting and very impactful effect on the field. And I am therefore very, very happy to have somebody with a construction grammar background, with a cognitive linguistic background here. She is kind of a seasoned plenary speaker. I counted her CV, this is probably like number 42 or something. And I'm very, very happy to be able to introduce her, and therefore please join me in welcoming Adele Goldberg.
Okay, so I wanted to thank the organizers, Slavek and Przemyslav, for organizing this conference, and Alexandra, I want to thank you for picking me up at the airport, and for so many of you who have already given really inspiring talks. So what I'm going to present today is actually just a part of a bigger project that's being copy edited now. It's a chapter in the book. And so I haven't given this talk before, and I hope that I can make this piece of the puzzle clear without getting into the other chapters. So, okay. So, I don't actually work directly on language evolution, and what I'm going to focus on is how language evolves in child learners. So that is, how do we get from this stage to conventional language? And I'm going to focus particularly on a piece of the puzzle that seems to present a paradox. So there's research that has argued that children tend to regularize, and I'll explain what that means in a minute, but basically, it involves generalizing more broadly than adults. But then there's other research that argues that children are conservative, and I'll explain that in a minute too, but basically it means that, that children generalize less broadly than adults. And you can see that it's hard to reconcile those two ideas. So by regularize, I have in mind the kind of experiment that's now classic by Hudson, Cam, and Newport, where they exposed children and adults to artificial languages, and this. So there's one verb, zilp, and there are a couple, few nouns, lion and tiger here, and there's an arbitrary determiner or little word that sits between the verb and the noun, sometimes but not always. And there's no conditioning; just it randomly appears 60% of the time in the input. That little random determiner is DAX here. So if the input looks like this, adults tend to reproduce the input. They tend to produce something that involves DAX about roughly the same 60% of the time. Children, on the other hand, seem to regularize. So they have a tendency to produce sentences that all have DAX, or even more frequently, that never have DAX. Okay, so they regularize, or they generalize more broadly than adults, it seems. I'll come back to it. Adults also do this in certain circumstances, but it's known that children seem to do this more than adults. Okay, on the other hand, there's a raft of experiments, a lot of them from Mike Tomasello's lab, but the research even goes back to work by McWhinney and others early on, that children tend to be conservative. And what this means is that if you expose a young child at 2 or 3 years old to a novel verb like pilk, and you explain what it means, so you show them this kind of event, so they see and they hear the glass pilked. So they're hearing this word pilk in an intransitive sentence frame. Now if you change the scene so that there's an action, and you ask adults to describe it, think about what you would say. You're likely to say, he pilked the glass. But interestingly, children tend not to do this. So if it's a child, they are more likely to just repeat the glass pilked, or avoid using it, or do something else. They're not as likely to generalize. So this figure comes from a paper from Mike Tomasello's lab, and each dot is a condition in various studies. So the y-axis is the percent of children that generalize a novel verb, like pilk, from intransitive to transitive. And the x-axis are the ages. And you can see that at 2, almost none of the kids are generalizing. But by the time they're 5, they generalize like adults do. Okay, so again, there's this seeming paradox. And honestly, I first noticed this when I was trying to teach this. And I realized, wait, I'm contradicting myself. Okay. But notice that there is a way to reconcile them. And that's what we're going to try to unpack. So in both cases, children are overusing one possible option. Okay, we're going to try to look at why they do that. So if we step back and ask, what is the child trying to do when they learn language? It seems obvious that from a child's perspective, what they're trying to do is understand messages given forms in order to comprehend language. And they also need to choose forms in order to convey their intended messages for the sake of production, speaking. And they also want to conform to the conventions of their community. So given these factors, what they need to do is they need to learn form, function, correspondences, and that's what I call constructions. Constructions are just learned pairings of form with function. So according to that definition, words are included as learned pairings of form and function. So words like evo-lang, jet lag, and notwithstanding are all constructions. And partially filled words, so otherwise known as morphemes. You can think of morphemes as a partially filled word where there's an open slot. So you can say pre-talk, pre-exam. You can make up new ones. It's productively used. We also have idioms, so these two come from Polish. So the first one I won't try to pronounce, but it means what does gingerbread have to do with windmills? And I think it means basically what's the point? Where are we going? And the second one is literally thinking of blue almonds, and it means that you're daydreaming. And we have idioms, of course, in English. Sometimes idioms are partially filled, so there's an open slot. There's one that seems to have become more and more popular. I get this in email a lot. I hope this message finds you well, or I hope this letter finds you well. Where you could understand it, it's compositional, but there's something formulaic about it that seems to have become more common. And then there are constructions that only have a bit of morphology filled. So a classic one is the X or the wire. So an example of that is the more you think about it, the less you understand, which is true of that idiom because when you stop to think of it, what is that? The more you think about it. It's not a noun phrase. It's not a sentence. It's something special that is possibly unique to this very construction. And then we have the double object construction, which a couple people have already talked about in different talks. So this has a verb and then 2 noun phrases right after it, like he gave her a fish taco, he baked her a muffin. And then, of course, we have constructions that everyone would always call constructions, like the passive construction. Okay, and I'm going to take for granted that our knowledge of constructions forms a network of interrelated knowledge, much as we've long thought about the lexicon. So in this diagram, each node is an example of a construction, and they cluster together. So the colors are supposed to be meaningful, that they similar examples pattern together to form a cluster. So what I'm going to focus on I'm going to take some time to go through some conditioning factors. And by conditioning factors, I have in mind the same thing that Olga Farrow was talking about in her talk yesterday. The idea is that conditioning factors, different kinds of things, determine which construction is the best match to use in a given context. That is, we want to predict, and we need to predict when we're speaking, a particular combination of constructions given our message, the context, the words, the phonology, the person we're talking to, and so on. Okay, so I'm going to, again, spend some time talking about a range of conditioning factors because I want to impress upon you that a handful of simple rules, like linguists often look for or try to explain, really don't get you that far when you're trying to learn a language. I mean, they do something, but there's so many quirky patterns in every language. So, for example, if you think about Spanish gender exists in Polish too, many languages. If you look at this pattern, you notice right away that the masculine form, L, tends to occur with words that end in O. So it's phonologically conditioned. And feminine occurs with words that end in A. But then there are subregularities. So it turns out that words that end in ma, that are from Greek, systematically take masculine. And there are also exceptions of words that end in O, like la mano, that are feminine. So you just need to learn the words as well as the generalizations. In English, the plural is generally semantically conditioned. So if something's plural, we treat it as plural, and we add an S, and the verb agrees with it. If it's singular, we treat it singularly. But in America, we treat teams as singular, so we would systematically say Manchester United is. But British English has the option of saying Manchester United are. So that's a dialect difference that people have to learn. In English, as far as I know, all varieties, all kinds of things, all kinds of pants are treated as grammatically plural, even though it's literally one thing just with two parts. So pants, shorts, capris, leggings, skirts. We don't have to know what these things are, but we know that they would be treated as grammatically plural. And also we have words that don't change when they're in the plural. So buffalo, elk, deer, fish, and many kinds of fish, including salmon, cod, snapper, are unmarked for plural. We can say one or more than one. And again, we don't have to know what these fish are, but it wouldn't surprise us to learn that this is also treated as singular or plural, the word grappo, for instance. One of my favorite kinds of conditioning factors involves subtle semantic differences. So again, constructions are used for purposes, for communication, and they usually have interesting communicative functions. So if you're at a wedding and Joe just married your daughter, it's lovely to say, welcome Joe, who married into the family. It's much different to say, here's Joe, or welcome Joe, who married his way into the family. Right, so you're using two different constructions, and they convey a systematic difference in meaning. So the second one involves creating a path and moving through it, and it's that idea that gives you this rude interpretation. Okay, another example is the double object construction that I mentioned before. So again, two noun phrases right after the verb. So Joe baked Anne a cake. And it has a paraphrase, Joe baked a cake for Anne, but the meaning is subtly different. So notice that the second sentence can be used in a wider range of contexts. So you can say Joe baked a cake for Anne if Joe was a fellow baker of, say, Bob, and Joe bakes it instead of Bob for Anne's wedding. Not the same Joe, anyway. Or you could use be if you have in mind that Joe baked a cake intending to throw it at Anne. But notice that you wouldn't say Joe baked Anne a cake. Joe baked Anne a cake has to mean that he intends to give her that cake. It has a very specific meaning. Okay. So meaning is really important. That's I think the most interesting conditioning factor, but there are many other conditioning factors. So it's well known, and the title of the book that I'm finishing is Explain Me This. And it's based on this example that sounds odd to native speakers. So we can of course say she told him something or she told something to him. But with the verb explain, we really prefer the to dative. And she explained him something sounds odd. It turns out that's part of a subregularity, a cluster of examples on its own. So this is based on a corpus study, but it's been long observed that verbs that sound Germanic, so people don't know the history of words necessarily, but short, easy words like tell, ask, buy, and give, prefer to occur or readily occur in the double object construction. So the black bar indicates the proportion of examples in the 500 million word COCA corpus that occur in the double object. Latinate words, on the other hand, tend to avoid it. So it's not just explain, it's a cluster of cases that include explain, request, purchase, and transfer. They rarely occur in the double object. But again, it's not enough just to know these cases. You also have to know that there are exceptions to the exceptions. That is, we learn a lot of really specific information. So guarantee sounds fancy in Latinate, but it prefers the double object. She guaranteed him something. Okay. So subject auxiliary inversion, that's a pattern in English. It occurs in several different constructions. That's where we invert the order of the subject argument and the auxiliary. So for example, in wishes, the first example is a simple statement, you may live a good life, but you can turn that into a wish if you say, if you invert the auxiliary and put that first. So may you live a good life. But notice that you can't do that with just every auxiliary. You can't do that with should. It sounds odd to say, should you live a good life, with that intended wish interpretation. Another pattern that also involves subject auxiliary inversion, but is different, requires an adverb at the front of the sentence. And these adverbs have to be interpreted in a negative sort of way. So it's fine to say, never had I gone there, or rarely had I gone there. But it's odd to say, always had I gone there, or frequently had I gone there. So that's another generalization that you have to learn about English. I've been working on another construction with Thomas Erbst, and this one fills a very interesting sort of social niche. So, okay, so first let's fill in the blank. If I ask you, it's blank of you to be here, what word comes to mind? Okay, so I think the Americans say nice, and the British might say good. Okay, that seems to have worked. Thank you. So, good enough, close enough. But what that shows you is that we're also aware of the frequencies of the words that occur in each construction. And psycholinguists are very well aware of this, that you know, we keep track of how often words occur in each construction. And I can evoke the most frequent word by giving you the construction. So the function of this construction fills this niche. People like to talk about each other, we like to judge each other and evaluate each other, and we do it on the basis of how we see other people acting. But we know, too, that the way a person acts at one moment might not be characteristic of how they are in general. So we have a devoted construction for this, it turns out. So you can say it's nice or it's good of you to be here. Notice you wouldn't say it's tall of you to reach the top shelf, right? Because this has to be used with an evaluative interpretation, and somebody being tall doesn't evaluate anything. You can say it's big of you to reach the top shelf, but then it doesn't mean big, it means generous of spirit, right? So it is, you pick out an evaluative interpretation of that adjective because the construction insists on it. And you are evaluating another person, either real or personified, so you wouldn't say it was good of the dishwasher to save water. Okay, so you get the idea. There are other constructions that convey attitude. I couldn't resist using this example. So, him, the president. That comes with an intonation pattern. Often people sort of lose their neck when they do this. And it has a special interpretation of incredulity. Another one is why read the newspaper, where that expresses some kind of disapproval or skepticism that isn't expressed by any of the words on their own, but when you put the words together, it implies that it's not worth your while to read the newspaper, or why bother reading the newspaper. Okay, and I'm going to talk about the last weird conditioning factor in a little more detail, because it'll come back. So it turns out there's a small class of adjectives that begin with an unstressed schwa. And they, even though they have adjectival meaning and they're treated like adjectives in every dictionary, they don't like to occur in the most obvious position for adjectives, which is before nouns. So native speakers find it odd to say an asleep child, or an alive monster, an ablaze building, or an afraid child. And that's something we have to learn. So it turns out it's not a general semantic restriction, because and by the way, you can confirm this with corpus data, and we've also confirmed it experimentally, that people avoid using those unstressed schwa adjectives, a adjectives, before nouns. But these adjectives do occur before nouns, so it's fine to say a sleeping child or a scared man, even though an afraid man is odd. And it's also not a phonological restriction. So it's fine to say an adult male or an acute illness. And that's easy to see in corpus data. So notice that adult isn't segmentable in terms of a plus dult. And acute, well, cute is a word, but it's not the right word for acute. Okay, so there's a diachronic explanation for this distribution, which is that in Old English, these a adjectives used to be prepositional phrases. So asleep historically came from in sleep, and afloat from on float. And notice that when they were prepositional phrases, it made sense that they shouldn't occur before nouns, because that is a general restriction. We don't say the on drugs man. We don't put prepositions before nouns. But what's interesting is today's speakers don't know about this diachrony. That's not why we're avoiding it. But the language just perpetuates the statistics that existed before, and speakers learn those statistics. Okay, so the constructionist usage-based view is that learners record statistics about particular items' distributions, and then constructions emerge as new memories become related to existing memories. That's how the clustering happens. Not a new idea, right? That goes back to Vygotsky. And we aim to understand and be understood while respecting our community norms. Okay, those are the three basic pillars of this kind of approach. So once an adult learns the conditioning factors for each of the constructions, so they know when to use things properly, and that requires accruing a huge amount of statistical information and clustering the examples. When you speak, you want to access the combination of constructions that best match your message in context. And as adults, we do that pretty well. So we can access memories according to any aspect of the memory, right? Our memory is associative and content addressable. Okay, so that's the case for adults. So what I wanted to do was give you a picture of what language looks like and this simple idea of what we do when we talk. Okay, but now it's fair to ask, what does gingerbread have to do with windmills? So how are we going to talk about, how are we going to address that, the paradox that I claimed I would try to address? Okay, so remember, in both cases of regularization and conservative language use, children overuse one option. So when they regularize, they either always use the DAX, one option, or they never use the DAX, a different one option. And when they're conservative, instead of switching to the transitive construction, they stick to the construction that they witnessed. Okay, so what I'm going to claim is that they do this because the more appropriate option isn't accessible before conditioning factors have been learned. So you don't know how to access a better option before you've well learned those conditioning factors. And they're complicated to learn. Okay, so if we think about the A adjectives, I'll just give you a bit of the experiments we've done on this. This was a postdoc, Jeremy Boyd, and it was a simple experiment. We wanted to understand what age kids started to recognize this constraint. So it was set up like this. Two identical animals, one's labeled by alive, an A adjective, and the other by some other adjective, which we don't really care about, small. One of them, a key one here, alive, moves to the star. The screen goes blank. And then we ask participants, which fox moved to the star? And what we're interested in is how they use alive. Do they say the alive fox moved to the star, using it before the noun? Or do they find some other way, like the fox that was alive moved to the star, so avoiding using it before the noun? And we compared adjectives, real A adjectives, with near synonyms, like living. Okay? So here's the data, and this is based on children between 6 and 17. And the y-axis is the percentage of prenominal productions. And what you see at the beginning, so the top line is the near synonyms, and the bottom line is the A adjectives. And adults avoid them before nouns, right? So that it should be low. But at 6, kids treat them alike. They don't have this constraint. They don't recognize the separate class of A adjectives. In fact, it's only when they're 10 years old that they systematically differentiate the A adjectives and use them less before nouns. And it takes still longer before they behave more like adults. So some of these conditioning factors take years to learn. So in our lab, we do a lot of novel construction learning experiments. And we do those because they're different than artificial language learning experiments, because we like to use non-English patterns so that you're to try to reduce the impact of English on both the form and the meaning. So we try to use things that don't exist in English in the same way. Okay, so for example, we've done a lot of work with adults. These were 2 different constructions. Just see if you can pick out the conditioning factors that distinguish these 2 constructions. The form is different, the word order is different. Okay, but I'm going to ask you to compare the scenes. Okay, so when people saw that, and 16 scenes with different animals and different actions, but that were sort of like that, they would hear something, both the animals would be described, the monkey, the panda, po, mooped. I'll just show it to you one more time. Okay, a different word order occurred, and then they would see something like this. Okay, now I'm only giving you one of each, right, which isn't nearly enough. But some of you might even guess that the difference between those 2 constructions was whether the action had a big impact or a small impact. Okay, so that was the novel meaning of this construction. And we changed the input in different ways to see if adults would be more sensitive to the word choice, more sensitive to the semantics. And what we found was that adults are good at this. So adults learn whatever conditioning factors are appropriate and for each construction, and then they generalize as you'd expect, as a rational generalizer would. But everybody who's done these kinds of experiments knows that you wouldn't give 2 novel word order constructions to a child, because they would never learn them at the same time. They would be completely confused. So when we do this kind of work with children, we simplify the novel constructions. So, for example, this is a different meaning.
The construction worker, the doctor keybows. The construction worker, the doctor keyboed.
Okay, so these are my 2 undergrads. So again, people saw 16 clips. In order to simplify it enough for kids, we kept the two people, the doctor and the construction worker, the same, but we used different novel verbs and different kinds of action, but they all involved approach. In fact, they all involved approach from the left to the right. I mean, we were really trying to make it simple. And then people had to test, the kids had to test, and sorry, we tested 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and adults. We gave them a forced choice task.
The construction worker, the Dr. Kibos.
Okay, so here I hope it's obvious to you, maybe you can't see well on the back, but the right answer is on the right. It's a familiar item, you've just seen that.
The construction worker, the Dr. Kibos.
So we also included novel cases, cases that required generalization that had a new action, a new novel verb, and new arguments. So it wasn't the doctor and construction worker anymore. Oh, sorry, I gave you the same one again. I didn't mean to. This is the novel one.
The princess, the basketball player, Pukos.
Okay, so if you saw 16 of those clips, you would be at ceiling. You would be able to choose it, the familiar items, you'd be able to choose it if I switched out the verb, and you'd be able to choose it if every word was new. You would have no trouble recognizing that this is about moving in one direction. Interestingly, 5-year-old children, though, with this amount of limited input, they did show evidence of recognizing the familiar items. They were paying attention. And they were above chance even when you switched the novel verb. But if it was a completely new example, they were at chance. And the 7-year-olds were in between. Okay, and we found similar kinds of effects in work with Liz Winnicott, where adults systematically, strongly outperform children. Children find conditioning factors hard. Okay, but of course, and this is important, they must, and they do, learn the conditioning factors that are unique to each construction. These children become native speakers of that language, and these statistics, these very specific statistics, get perpetuated. So they do eventually learn them. But when before a child has fully absorbed them, their input is more scarce, they haven't organized the input in their minds as well. So here's the adult with this nicely diagrammed constructicon, and here's the child where I just blocked out some of the knowledge, right? They haven't organized it well. And for the child, the access is more difficult. And what do we do if you can't access the most appropriate construction or in a context? You use a good enough match, right? What else would you do? Okay. So now we're going to see how this plays out. So I'm going to try to bring the pieces together. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about another experiment. This is with Jesse Schwab and Casey Lou Williams. So again, we wanted to make it very simple. We had 8 puppets, and there was 1 nonsense verb and 2 little particles before the nouns. We used English nouns to make it really simple. So people would hear, and we counterbalanced everything, but I'm going to just use one example. So people would hear, and this was 6-year-old children and adults, would hear Moop Dax woman, Moop Dax girl, Moop Dax dancer, Moop Dax book. And then they'd hear Moop Po boy, Moop Po father, Moop Po doctor, Moop Po ball. And they saw this repeated 6 times for each of these puppets. Now, okay, now if you're asked to produce something with a grandma and a grandpa, what do you think is the conditioning factor? Gender, right? You're adults. This is easy. So you perform at ceiling. You recognize that gender is the conditioning factor, even though we included 1 inanimate object. And we did that to make it more ecologically valid, because again, there are typically exceptions to every generalization. What did the children do? Their productions are almost at chance. So on the grandma and grandpa, they are at chance. Kids don't notice this conditioning factor. And we tested them. We thought, are these kids really just super progressive and they're not distinguishing males and females? But no, in fact, they use he and she on these exact puppets perfectly, as you would expect. Okay, so now let's look at what they did do. So first for adults, in the production task, we repeated each of these test items 3 times, and it was half male, or half that were intended to be one determiner and half that were intended to be the other. So each dot is a person, and the proportion of one of the determiners used was 50-50 for adults, as it would have to be correct, because half of the items were one and half of the items were the other. Okay, more interesting is what did kids do? So again, they did not pick up on gender. What did they do? They regularized. That is, what I mean by that is they either used DAX, 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 those are the kids at the top, or they used po, 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 po. And again, it was counterbalanced. I'm just giving you example ones. That is, they tended to stick to one or the other. There are fewer kids in the middle. Okay, but now we can ask why. So the hypothesis is that the reason they do that is because kids are unduly influenced by whichever option is more accessible. So they're basically only able to recall one of the determiners reliably, so they overuse it. Okay, it's a repetition bias is the idea. Now the alternative is that kids prefer a general rule. They prefer to regularize, or they have some instinct to regularize. So you can tease these two apart with a different kind of task. So you can reduce the accessibility demands if you offer them both options. Okay? And so that's what we did in a second task with a different group of kids, same age, same exposure, but now at task, we offered them both options, and again, we counterbalanced the order, and we were very careful with the intonation. So I might not get the intonation right, but it was not supposed to bias them to one or the other. So we just said, which sounds better, moop po woman or moop dax woman? Okay, here's the production data that you saw before. Now the question is, what do they do when you offer them both options? Well, strikingly, they really don't get gender. So even when you give them both options, and you ask them to choose, for the new items, the gray is the generalizable items, they're a chance. But they are above chance and above how they do in production on when you give them this option. That is, they're remembering some of the examples, even though they haven't organized it in terms of gender. Also, when you give them we can ask, what is it that they did? Are they just going back and forth randomly? Well, this is what they did before. They just stuck to one. Now, they recognize that both options are possible. So now they're closer to 50-50. So whereas before they stuck to one, now you see evidence that first, they're accruing the item-specific information. They're better on the familiar items. And they do recognize that, yes, some of them were fine with DAX and some with PO, and they don't know which are which, but they know that both are okay. So there are more kids in the middle. Okay, so from that, it looks like children are unduly influenced, in fact, by whichever option is more accessible. And in fact, we've seen this before. In the Hudson, Cam, and Newport paper, it's remembered for focusing on evidence for generalization, but they also included a forced choice recognition task, and in that, the kids showed that they were not biased toward one or the other. They chose both options. It was only in production, where they had to access from memory one of them, that they over-relied on one. We know that adults also overproduce one option when the input becomes too complicated, and Newport and Cam have shown that. Also, particularly in production, when you have accessibility demands, that's when we tend to over-regularize or over-rely on whatever's more accessible, and under pressure to communicate. And I know some people here, Kenny Smith's group has done a lot of this interesting work. We also know something about conditioning factors, which ones are harder to learn. A lot of this work goes back to early work by McWhinney and Bates, two of my heroes. So in the case of children, we know they have less working memory, less linguistic experience, less metalinguistic skill. That makes it harder for them in general. We also know if the conditioning factor is less available, as it was, for example, in the gender paradigm, because some of the objects, some of the puppets were inanimate, that makes it harder. So it's not as uniform. If the cues are less reliable, that is, if they're probabilistic, that also makes the conditioning factor harder to learn. Also, and I won't get into this today, but I'm also interested in how learning the conditioning factors is harder for second language learners. And it seemed, the idea is that it's harder for them when the factors are irrelevant or maybe even contradictory in their first language. So I didn't say a lot more. There's a lot more to say about the conditioning factors, how you learn them, how you fine-tune them, and I don't have time to get into that. But I want to emphasize the bigger point. So why isn't the best option accessible? When do we have problems? Well, sometimes if the input is unconditioned, then there is no best option. It doesn't matter. There's no functional difference. Sometimes the learner just doesn't know the conditioning factors. And we saw that with the gender puppets. They just didn't know conditioning. We tend to call those look like regularization. They take one option and make it system-wide. Consider this case. So this is also a well-known case in word use. So children are known to overextend words. They might call all animals dog, okay? So they'll point to a cow and say dog. But we know from old experiments, Kuchak and Huttenlocher, Nagels and Gelman, that if you ask these children to point to the dog, do they point to the cow? No, they systematically point to the dog. Well, what does that mean? It means, so this is, the best option, which is cow, doesn't exist for them. Okay, I don't mean it doesn't exist. So there is a better option, cow, that's what we would use. Different things could be happening with the child, but whatever it is, cow is not accessible to them. It could be that they've heard the word cow, but or it could be that they haven't even heard the word cow. Okay, that's one possibility. It could be that they don't know what cow means, so they don't have the conditioning factors for cow. Or it could just mean that the better option, cow, is not accessible at their moment of speaking. And what is accessible is the more frequent word dog. Okay. So what happens in this conservative learning? It's very similar. So in these experiments that have shown the kids resist using verbs in new constructions, usually it's not that they never use the transitive construction. They do use it with other verbs. So the reason they're resistant to doing it in these paradigms is that either the conditioning factors are unknown for either the intransitive or the transitive construction, maybe they're not fully general yet, or the best option, the transitive use, isn't sufficiently accessible at the moment of speaking. And the more available option, which is the one they just heard, the intransitive use, is what they produce. So again, if the best option is not accessible, what we all do is use a good enough option. So this is to say that there are different reasons why a better option may not be available. But what we all do is, if a best option doesn't exist, we use a good enough option. I'm just going to give you a couple more examples before concluding. If you see something like this, you're likely to call it a dog, because we don't have a better word for it. Okay, and this is also why we use language creatively, right? So we're always encountering new situations where we might want to say something, and if we don't have a formulaic way to say it, if we don't have something in memory that matches, we find something that's good enough. And so this actually relates to the topic open-endedness that Croft had talked about and that Meyer had talked about in Wendy's Sadler's talk. So we do this also in English for verbs. So you can say, my son was barked into a creek by one of their dogs, where bark is suddenly used in a passive, which it isn't usually. Or I can't drink away their visits. This all happened on one weekend. No, I'm kidding. Um, um, okay. Okay, so to conclude, what I hope to have impressed upon you is that constructions are conditioned by a wide variety of very subtle factors. A handful of rules like you might get from principles and parameters just doesn't a language make. We aim to express our messages while conforming to our speech communities. That's why we learn these sometimes stupid facts, like these exceptions, and we don't regularize over our lifetime. When we can't access the optimal constructions, we access close enough matches, and that's how we get to be creative. And all of these, regularization and conservative learning and overextensions, arise from accessing a good enough option, and so does creativity. That's when there is no better option, so we have to get creative. Okay, so I again want to thank everyone, and I thank you for not thinking of blue almonds during the talk.